Hello, this is Craig with Carshalton Advisory, and this is part 2 of our run-through of the practice tasks for section 2.2 of the Microsoft Excel Expert version 2016 Exams Study Guide. Let's get started. So for our first task here today, they've asked us to open the 2.2b workbook. So I have the directory open here. I'm going to double-click the 2.2b workbook to open it up. Perfect. So now for the range for this this table here, or this range of A4 through K94, we're going to create a formula-based conditional formatting rule that evaluates what's in cell B1, which is right here where it says Spain, and it's going to apply a yellow fill color to all the cells of each row that has that same country or region value in column I. So in this column over here, if this column over here equals what's in cell B1, we want the entire row to be yellow filled. So this, all the conditional formatting that we're going to be doing in this section are going to be a little bit more involved. We won't be able to rely quite as much on the previously made ones, and we're actually going to have to create some formulas that are going to tell Excel when we want these cells to be highlighted. So to start off on this one, let's highlight this whole range. So I'm going to hit Control Shift down, and then I'm going to right over, or use the right arrow to move over until I hit the edge of this table. Now that I've done that, I'm going to use my shortcut to open conditional formatting, which is Alt H L, and I'm going to create a new rule, so that's N at the bottom. All right, now that I've done that, we are going to have to use a formula to determine which cells to format. All right, so what we're looking for is a formula that's going to create a true value when the cell, or in that row, meets the criteria in cell B1. So what we're going to do is start off with an equal sign. Now our important row is column I over here, which is where the country code is going to come from. So that is column I, and I remember that we started in row 4, and so we want anytime anything in column I equals B1, so we'll put B1. We want this to trigger true, and we want the format to have a fill color of yellow. Okay, so that gives us a preview of what our fill is going to look like. Now, however, this formula isn't going to work for us, because what if we're not in cell I4? The other thing that happens is this is going to default to a relational reference. So as Excel evaluates, it's going to evaluate this cell, and it's going to evaluate this cell, and as it does that, the reference to cell B1 is going to move as well. So what we need to do is to fix some of these references and make them absolute. So for I4, what we want is it for not necessarily to be just row 4. So we want row 4 to float, or excuse me, we want row 4 to float, but we want column I to stay locked. So we are going to hit F4 until we get the $ here in front of the I. So that's going to lock the reference to column I. For the B1, we don't want that to move at all. So we are going to hit F4 to fix that reference to only cell B1 and not for it to move. So now what happens when Excel evaluates, for example, cell A4 here? What it's going to do is it's going to look over to column I and check column I to see if it matches what's in B1. Then it's going to evaluate B4, and because of that locked reference, it's going to go all the way and look in column I4. So on and so forth, every cell down the table. So let's click OK and see what this looks like. Okay, so we can see first off that row number 15 has been highlighted, and if I go over to column I, sure enough, it's Spain. It matches what's in B1. We can scroll down. Here's another one, and there's a few more at the bottom here. So it seems that everything that is marked Spain has been highlighted by this rule. But let's give it a test. So what we can do is we can change what is in cell B1 and see if our conditional formatting is going to reflect our new input here. So Italy's the first on the list there in row 4. So I'm going to type in Italy. And sure enough, where Spain was highlighted before, that's no longer formatted, and the row with Italy is now marked bright yellow. Fantastic. It looks like it's working for us. Now, one comment as an aside, we learned all about data validation in the last lesson. And here's an opportunity where data validation would be really important. If I was to use this or distribute it to any of my colleagues, I would want to lock the entry in cell B1. I wouldn't want them to have to type in Italy, because if they're like me, they'll spell it wrong and nothing will work. So this would be a great example of using a drop-down list, so that when a user clicks in this cell, there's going to be a little down arrow, and they'll be able to scroll down to all of the countries that are reflected in our table here. And we don't have to worry about them typing in something wrong. Everything that's in here will be in our list. Unfortunately, that's not something that we'll be able to do through this practice task video review, but something, best practices going forward when you do this on your own, is something to keep in mind. So we're comfortable now with this first task. So let's move on to our next one. All right, so for our next one, we're going to move to the accounts receivable worksheet. I'm going to do that by hitting Control Page Down. All right, in this case, we are going to be using a mod function. And essentially, it's going to set a formula-based background for our table here. So it's not actually going to respond to a value in the cell. And the goal at the end is there's going to be one row that is filled gray and one row that is not filled gray, so to help keep it visually more appealing for the user. Now, I'll be honest, before I went through this course, I had never used a mod function before. And so I had to do a little bit of research in order to figure out what it was and what it was about. And since then, I've actually used it a lot. I'll show you an example when we're done here that will give you an idea of the things you can do with the mod function. So the first thing I'm going to do is highlight all the cells in this table. Okay, and I did that by Control, Shift, down arrow, and then I used the right arrow to move to the right. Next, we're going to go into conditional formatting, and I've used my mouse this time. We'll use a new rule, and we're going to select a formula again. All right, so what the mod formula does, if you've never used one before, is essentially it calculates the remainder in a fraction. So in this case, we're going to start off by typing in our mod function. And so it's going to give us, it needs to know two values. It needs to know the numerator and the denominator, and then its response is the remainder that's left over. So in this case, what we're going to use is, for the numerator, is a row function. And by hitting row, open, close parenthesis, it's going to return whatever the row number is. So over here for this row, it's going to return 4, 5, 6. We don't have to worry about it referencing any value in the table. It's automatically going to return its row function. Next, we're going to use the number 2 for the denominator on the bottom of our function. So basically, for every cell, it's going to take a look at what row it's in and divide that by 2 and give us the remainder. So let's think this through logically. So in row 4, it's going to divide 4 by 2. Okay. And what's the remainder when you divide 4 by 2? Well, there's no remainder because 2 will go into it twice. Now in row 5, what's going to happen is it's going to divide 5 by 2. So 2 will go into 5 2 times, but there will be a 1 left over as a remainder. When we go into row 6, we're back to having a 0 as a remainder. So we want to solve this function that when the remainder is equal to 0, there is going to be a formatting occur. And what that formatting is going to be is light gray background to fill color. So I believe that is this one here. Actually, it's going to be this one because here's light gray background to color. We'll select that and click OK. So now let's click OK and see if that works for us. Okay, perfect. So now when we look at this table, we have an alternating pattern of a fill and an unfilled row in order to make it a little bit easier to follow along from what's in the first column to line up all the way to the last. Now I guess this is our bonus technique here. I don't really like how this looks. I find an every other row alternating is too much, too busy for me. So I'm going to select all this again. I'm going to go into our conditional formatting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into manage rules. So that's what we select in order to change rules that have already been set up. So I've selected that. Here's our conditional formatting rules manager. Here's the rule that we just created, and I'm going to select edit. All right, so I don't like how that looks. But you know what? I think would look good. What if we're going to do 2 rows with a fill and 2 rows without? Now, how can we do that with a mod function? So in my head, that's a 4-row pattern that keeps repeating. 2 on, 2 off. So for our mod function, we're going to keep the row, and instead of dividing it by 2, let's divide that by 4. Okay, so now we're going to have a range of remainders. So for example, in row 4, our remainder is going to be 0. In row 5, our remainder is going to be, well, let's go 5 divided by 4 goes in once with 1 remaining. So remainder 1, 6 is going to be remainder 2, 7 is going to be remainder 3. So we've got remainders of 0, 1, 2, and 3. So what we want is for 2 of them to give us a gray fill. So I'm going to say when the remainder is less than 2, I want a gray fill. And if the remainder is greater than 2, there's going to be no fill. So let's click this and see what happens. We're going to click apply and take a look at our table. Sure enough, our table now reflects 2 rows filled, 2 rows unfilled. I find that a little easier on the eyes, but more importantly, I hope as you've thought through this, there's lots of places you can use a mod function. In some of my financial analysis work, I use it to trigger, let's say I want a bonus paid every 12 months, or specifically in December of every year. So I can set up a mod function, use 12 as the denominator, and remainder of 0 to trigger a bonus payment in my model. And then I can have the model set up so that if I change my columns from being a monthly value to a quarterly, that mod function will automatically keep up to date and still always pay that in the final period of the year. Anyways, mod formula is a lot of fun, and there's a lot of places you can use that. But let's get back to task for this practice session. I believe this is completed now, even though it's going to look a little bit different than what it was before. Let's move on to our next task. All right, so now we're going to go on to our products table. And for the range from A2 to B78, so we're selected into cell A2, and I'm going to Control Shift down and right arrow, and so yeah, that goes all the way to B78. So now we're going to apply a formula-based conditional formatting rule that applies a red fill color and bold font to the cells in the rows that contain the highest values and the lowest values in the change in units sold column. And then we're going to have to test this out by entering a new high and low value. All right, so let's go into our conditional formatting section by Alt-HL and N for a new rule. All right, we are going to have to use a formula. So how they've answered this in the book, I'll be frank, it's not a way I would ever use it in real life. Normally what I would do here is I would just create two rules, one that selects the highest value, one that selects the lower value, and it'll work just fine. In this case, they want us to do it in a single row. So let's think this through. The first thing we want to do is figure out what the max value is going to be. Okay, so our formula is going to be a max formula, and we're going to want to select our whole range of values. So in this case, it is the range of B2, B2 all the way through to B78, because that is our column. B is our column that has the change in units sold values. So we want to have the max in there, and we want that to highlight all the cells in the row. So what it's going to say is if the value in B2 is the maximum, then it's going to highlight it for us. And it's going to highlight it in, we're going to click the format tier, we are going to click red for the color, and select the font. We're going to select bold for the font style. So let's take a look. All right, don't look too closely, that's horrible on the eyes. So I'm pretty comfortable with how this looks. There's a couple changes that we need to make. First off, we need to make some absolute references instead of relative. So we want to make sure it's always the value in column B that is getting evaluated. So in order to do that, we are going to use, you can either enter a $sign before the B or use F4 and continue to press it until the B is highlighted. Next, we need to lock this range down as well so that this doesn't change either. So we are going to use an absolute reference. I can highlight that whole area and hit F4, and it's going to lock all those down for me. So now I'm pretty confident that this is going to highlight the row that has the max value. In fact, let's check it out here. I'm going to click OK, and let's take a look here. All right, sure enough, we have a single row highlighted, and I'm going to trust that that is the max value. But that's only half of what they've asked us to do here. So let's go back and select this area. We're going to go back into the conditional formatting, manage rules. We're going to select our rule and click enter. So we have the max done, but we also need the minimum. So because this is where the formula is true, we're going to be able to use what's the OR function. Okay, so then this way it's going to give us a true value when either the first statement is true or the second statement. So we'll keep this max for our first statement. And now we need to find the minimum. So I'm going to be lazy here. I'm going to select this because I'm familiar with the syntax for min, and it's the same as max. And I'm just going to paste it in because I know that everything is right. I'll put a space there to make it a little bit more clear. I'm going to change this now from max to min. So now I have one half of the formula that's finding the absolute maximum value, one half of the formula that's going to find the min value. And it's going to give me a solid filled row if either of those are true. Or in fact, when both of those are true, both when it's the highest value and when it's the minimum value, but nothing else. So let's click OK and see if this worked. Apply. Okay, so now I have a value of minus 19.3 is highlighted, and the same one again is highlighted of 19.7 positive. So let's test this out by changing one of these values. So I'm going to just overwrite this. I'm going to make that 0 just because I know that won't be the lowest value anymore. and hit enter. Okay, it's no longer highlighted. Let's see what it's found. Okay, almost to the bottom here. There is another row. It is now highlighted in red. So I'm comfortable that we have this correct now. This has been a long video session, but I think it had some really powerful stuff in it, and I hope you'll find it useful both to pass the exam, but also to apply to the stuff that you're doing in your regular professional work. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe or give me a thumbs up. I look forward to working with you again here. Thanks for watching.